Part 4. Questions and Answers from the course on Genesis taught in 1981 and 1982. Editor's note. These question and answer sessions have been transcribed from tape recordings of other Seraphim's talks. Section titles have been added by the editor. 1. The Age of the Earth. Student. According to Biblical Chronology, the Earth is about 5,500 years old. But according to the evolutionists, and even history as it is taught in high schools, the Earth is billions of years old. How do you explain this? Father Seraphim. We have a few books on the subject which I will show you. There are a number of people in the last 10 or 20 years who have begun to make a counterattack against people who are extremely sure about this theory. There is a group in San Diego called the Institute for Creation Research and another up in Michigan called the Creation Research Society. They have come out with some quite scientific books which go into this question. On what basis do people make their assumptions about these millions and billions of years? It turns out that there is a lot more hypothesis than fact in this theory. There is a book by an evolutionist called The Growth of a Prehistoric Time Scale, in which the author, William B. N. Barry, admits that to interpret the millions and billions of years, it has to be assumed that the fossilized creatures in the lower levels of rocks are the evolutionary ancestors of those in the higher levels. But it often happens that these layers are in the wrong order according to evolutionary theory. The layers with more primitive organisms are on top. Therefore, it's like in the times of Copernicus. Then there was the Ptolemaic interpretation of the movement of the heavenly bodies, that the sun, planets and stars all go around the earth. The question arose, why don't the planets correspond to the stars? Some of the ancients said it is because they are on different spheres. That is, the stars are further away and the planets are closer. Therefore, the planets appear to go faster. But then why do the planets sometimes go forward and sometimes backwards? In order to explain how they moved, the Ptolemaic astronomers had to say that they go around each other somehow in a very complex movement of cycles and epicycles as they swing around the Earth. Some are going backwards, others are performing figure eights. It became so complex to follow the movements of these planets according to this Ptolemaic model that Copernicus got the idea that maybe they were all wrong. Maybe the Earth and the planets were going around the Sun. He began making calculations on the basis of this idea, and his theory was much simpler. Finally, we came to accept that theory as the true one. Like the Ptolemaic astronomers, evolutionists who study strata containing fossils often find that they are upside down, in the wrong order, or too close together according to evolutionary ideas. They call these disconformities paraconformities or pseudo-conformities. They have to make allowances for the fact that everything is in the wrong order. If you ask them how they know what is the right order, they will admit that the only reason they know the right order is that they know evolution is true. You see, there is something funny about it. They are supposed to prove the theory, and to prove the theory, they have to start with the theory. Therefore, it's not as factual as it's presented. The Scientific Creationists, as they call themselves, have some interesting books about evidences of how old the Earth is. It just depends on what kind of evidence you're using. It is a very hypothetical question. It is not nearly as definite as the book of Genesis. 2. Carbon-14 dating. Student. What about the carbon-14 dating system? Father Seraphim. Carbon dating is only used on organic substances. The half-life of carbon-14 is 5,700 years, so obviously this method can't go back too far. Some people think you can go back 20,000 years or more with it, but this involves so much guesswork that it cannot be accurate. Even people who defend it say that it is fairly reliable back to about 3,000 years ago, but if it goes back further than that, it gets more and more unreliable. The system is based on a whole set of assumptions. Footnote: Robert Lee, assistant editor of the Anthropological Journal of Canada, writes about the uncertainty involved in radiocarbon dating. The troubles of the radiocarbon dating method are undeniably deep and serious. Despite 35 years of technological refinement and better understanding, the underlying assumptions have been strongly challenged. Continuing use of the method depends on a fix-it-as-we-go approach, allowing for contamination here, fractionation there, and calibration whenever possible. It should be no surprise, then, that fully half the dates are rejected. The wonder is surely that the remaining half come to be accepted. No matter how useful it is, though, the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results. There are gross discrepancies, the chronology is uneven and relative, and the accepted dates are usually the selected dates. Radiocarbon, Ages in Error, Anthropological Journal of Canada, Volume 19, Number 3, 1981, pages 9 and 29. End of footnote. According to the scientists, the most reliable dating system is not a radiocarbon but tree-ring dating, dendrochronology. They were recently able to test a whole series of things, comparing radiocarbon dates with tree-ring dates, and they found out that the radiocarbon dating method was off more than they thought. The tree-ring counts have tended to give greater ages by several centuries than radiocarbon ages. Other radiometric dating methods are used to get older ages of millions and billions of years, the potassium-argon method, etc. There are all kinds of assumptions involved in these methods also. You have to accept these assumptions before the systems work. All of them go on the assumption that there was no contamination over the centuries between one element and the other, and that there was none of the end elements, daughter components, present at the beginning. The evolutionists don't know that. They assume it was all uniformitarian from zero to what we know now. If that's true and the rate has been uniform, then we can calculate the age of the fossils somewhat accurately. But if it's not true, the whole system could be very far off. And there have been notorious mistakes. People have done radiometric tests on rock which has just formed recently, and they have come up with ages of up to 3 billion years. 3. Geological strata. Student: what about the different strata, like in the Grand Canyon, which are assumed to be deposited at a certain rate? Father Seraphim: there is a vast scientific question regarding these strata. The strata don't have little signs that say, I'm 5 million years old, I'm 10 million years old. There's an excellent book on this subject, The Genesis Flood by Henry Morris, in which he interprets these strata in terms of a single universal catastrophe, that is, Noah's flood. It is presented scientifically. You can examine it and see whether it makes sense or not. I think more people should look at both of these sides of the picture and see which model makes more sense. There are many respects in which the evolutionary model about these strata has holes in it. In fact, the evolutionists themselves will probably tell you that. The question is, does the other model make more sense? When it comes to something like these strata, of course, it is a scientific question. The deposition of the strata is obviously a scientific process that occurred in time. Footnote: some of the most interesting research in this area has been done by French geologist Guy Berthold, first at the Institut de Mécanique de Fluides at Marseille, and later at the Hydraulics Laboratory of Colorado University's Engineering Research Center. Since 1985, writes Richard Milton, Berthold has carried out a series of laboratory experiments involving pouring sediments into large tanks of moving water to study the internal structure of the strata and how lamination takes place. What Berthold found was that the sediments settled on the bottom more or less immediately, but the fine particles were separated from larger particles by current flow, giving the appearance of layers. The results were published by the French Academy of Sciences in 1986 and 1988 and were presented to the National Congress of Sedimentologists at Brest in 1991. The laboratory work has not been carried out in isolation, but has been supplemented by field observations from natural disasters such as the Colorado Bijou Creek flood of 1965, the formation of sediments following the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980, and ocean drilling by the Glomar Challenger survey vessel in 1975. According to Berthold, these experiments contradict the idea of the slow build-up of one layer followed by another. The time scale is reduced from hundreds of millions of years to one or more cataclysms producing almost instantaneous lamina. These innocent-sounding words are the death knell of the idea that the existence of thousands of meters of sediments is by itself evidence for a great age of the earth. End of footnote. Therefore, it is different from the 6 days of creation. It is a question of what happened after the 6 days. It is open to one's own scientific approach. 4. A matter of models. Father Seraphim. Scientists have what are called models. Yesterday we discussed the Ptolemaic model, that the Earth is the center of the universe and that all the stars and planets go around the Earth. Since, according to what one can observe, the planets move around the Earth at different speeds than the stars, the Ptolemaic astronomers had to have theories about how they went back and forth and formed figure eights, etc. Like right now, you can see that for the last 6 months or so, Saturn and Jupiter have been in the sky together. If you were observing, you could see that at first one went forward, then they both went backward. Then Saturn became fainter and Jupiter became brighter. According to the Copernican model, you can explain that this is because they are in different phases in their orbits as they go around the Sun. From our point of view, they seem to get closer together, when actually they are simply going around the Sun. Another example is Venus. Right now, Venus has become once more an evening star low on the horizon. A few months ago, it was a morning star. It was there already in the morning before the sun rose. The Ptolemaic model was found to be lacking because it did not explain the facts as well as the Copernican model. Copernicus said that if we interpret the Earth and the other planets as going around the Sun, then all these motions make sense. That is, they are mathematically very simple to explain. Eventually, that was accepted. Now, by calculating according to the Copernican model, we can send rocket ships quite close to Saturn and not miss. In fact, it is astonishingly accurate. So obviously it seems to be true that all the planets do indeed go around the Sun, even though, according to our observation, the Sun goes around the Earth. Therefore, it is very important what kind of models you have of things. In this course, we are going to study the Patristic model of the 6 days of creation. 5. The origin of the heavenly bodies. Patristic Cosmogony. Father Seraphim. The Genesis account of the 4th day of creation is very difficult to fit into the usual ideas of the evolution of the universe, because the scriptures and the Holy Fathers state quite certainly that the sun was created on that day, after the earth and the plants and the trees were already there. Furthermore, the Fathers say that the sun, the moon and the stars, and all the black holes and whatever is out there, were all created on the 4th day in one instant. God waved his hand and the whole thing came into being trillions of miles away. Of course, God is bigger than the universe, so why wouldn't he be able to do that? He has no problem. This gives you a totally different outlook on the world. It is a whole cosmogony, the explanation of the beginning of things. The modern evolutionary cosmogony, popularized by people like Carl Sagan, holds that there was a point which had a big bang and then everything developed from that without any God. Footnote: the man acknowledged as the father of the Big Bang cosmogony was Abbé Georges Lemaitre, 1894-1966, a Jesuit priest. One day in 1931, while reading an article on the origin and end of the world, he came up with the idea that the universe exploded and then evolved out of a primeval atom. A contemporary of his fellow Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin, he tried to do for astronomy what Teilhard had done for biology, create a synthesis of Christianity and the evolutionary worldview of modern science. His primeval atom is of course the cosmogonic equivalent of Darwin's primeval soup, out of which life is supposed to have emerged and evolved. The idea of evolution, wrote Lemaitre, has played an important role in the development of astrophysics. The evolution of the world can be compared to a display of fireworks that has just ended. End of footnote. If you believe in that, it is natural to believe that the bigger body, the Sun, came first, and that it somehow shot off the Earth. There are all kinds of different theories about how it did that. Some think the Sun was formed from a gas and dust cloud, and that its heat drove out the gas, leaving only the dust, which condensed and cooled down, forming the planets. Others think that the Sun almost collided with a passing star, causing gases to be torn off the solar surface, and that these gases later formed into planets. These different theories are all speculations, because no one was around at that time, and those things are not happening now. They are perhaps in accordance with what we think should be true, because it seems the bigger bodies should be antecedent to the smaller bodies. But according to Genesis and the Holy Fathers, the Earth, this small little thing, this speck in the universe, was first, and the tremendous Sun came after it. Nowadays, atheist philosophers like to say that the relative size of the Earth proves man is but a speck lost in the universe. They say, the Earth is so small, the universe is so big, so obviously the universe is more important than man, and God did not make everything for man. But if you think in terms of what the Fathers say, that the Sun was made after the Earth had already been there, then it is clear that everything was made for man. Student: in our galaxy there are so many other suns. Do the Holy Fathers say anything about those suns? Father Seraphim: no, because they knew less about the composition of the universe than we know now, and there is simply no practical reason to speak much about them, except to say that they are there and God created them. The only place we know man lives is right here. Student: is there any conflict at all between the Orthodox understanding of the creation of the world and the fact that there is more than one sun? Father Seraphim: no, because there's only one sun for us. Student: the other suns are stars. Father Seraphim: yes, for us they aren't suns. The sun is a particular thing which is the center of our life, which gives us light and warmth, around which we grow, and without which we can't live. The other stars aren't central to us like that. If there were other suns with other earths, it would make things more complicated. We have no information that such a thing is true. The Scriptures and the Fathers always look upon things as seen from the earth. You can't place yourself in some hypothetical place in some other galaxy and look back on Earth. That's a totally abstract way of looking at things, since we aren't there but right here. We're told what we need to save our souls, and we're not told a single thing about any of these other suns, planets, etc. If it were useful for us to know that, God would have told us. In fact, it is a very interesting thing. From all the space probes to other planets so far, it looks as though there have been deliberate indications to show to us that the Earth is the place where life is. Other places are dead bodies. Student, what about speculation concerning beings from other planets? Father Seraphim. People who look for beings on other planets get bound up with the whole occult philosophy of life, that there are higher beings who are coming to rescue us and help us out. We just bow down to them and they will give us all the powers we need. Actually, all these myths about beings on other planets correspond to what we know about demons and how they operate. When you start speculating about them and get involved with ideas about higher races of extraterrestrials, it all comes down to demons. Besides angels, the only kind of intelligent beings we know of is demons. 6. Scientific Creationists. Father Seraphim. There is a lot of literature nowadays concerning the question of creation and evolution. It has become quite a vital question, especially in the last 10 or 20 years. Recently, there was a very one-sided article in Time magazine which made fun of people who are against evolution. It made them look like cuckoos, imbeciles, who were going back to the time before the Scopes monkey trial, and so forth. But if you read the literature of some of these creationist groups, it's very interesting. There is one group in San Diego called the Institute for Creation Research, which puts out some very interesting books. One is called Creation, the Facts of Life, which goes into some of the scientific questions. Another one is about fossils, evolution, the fossils say no. There is an excellent book called Scientific Creationism, which is meant as a textbook for high schools. There is a good suburb book on dinosaurs which is not heavy-handed at all. It doesn't mention anything about evolution, but just gives the story of dinosaurs. It is for people who want to read without having all kinds of scientific hypotheses forced upon them. This particular group is very good because they do not try to push the Bible. They know they could not get into public schools if they did, and therefore they have books like Scientific Creationism that present the material purely from the scientific point of view. And they present it not simply as anti-evolutionists. Instead, they present two models, just like what we were saying about the Copernican model versus the Ptolemaic model. They present the creationist model versus the evolutionist model, and then they ask the question, which model better explains facts? The book Scientific Creationism gives you a whole series of facts, then gives you the explanation according to the creationist model and according to the evolutionist model. They think that the creationist model makes more sense because the evolutionists have to make all kinds of cycles and epicycles to explain all kinds of embarrassing things. In 1960, the famous movie Inherit the Wind, about the Scopes trial of 1925, greatly influenced how the general public regarded the creation-evolution debate. The movie depicted the famous atheist lawyer Clarence Darrow as a great hero because he stood for science, progress, the future of mankind, and so forth. It wasn't quite so simple as all that. Footnote: in fact, the movie, based on the play by Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee, was a highly fictionalized account of the trial and the events surrounding it. In real life, the Scopes trial was not a serious criminal prosecution, but a mock trial used as a test case by the ACLU. John T. Scopes was a volunteer defendant who was never in danger of going to jail. See Philip E. Johnson, Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. End of footnote. But after the movie came out, many people who were dubious about evolution got rather scared because they didn't want to be accused of being anti-progress and anti-science. Nevertheless, during the last 20 years, there have been some very interesting scientific treatises written on the subject, bringing up the many proofs of evolution which are questionable. These proofs are often presented in high school textbooks as truth and fact, but when you look closely, you find that they aren't facts. For example, they bring up the so-called fact that a human embryo recapitulates its evolutionary ancestry, that there are gill slits on the throat, and so forth. However, if you read any evolutionary textbook now on embryology, it will say this is a myth. The gill slits have nothing to do with evolution or recapitulation. That's simply the way the embryo develops. In fact, the development of the brain, the nerves, the heart, etc. inside the embryo totally contradicts the way it should be if it is only recapitulating evolutionary ancestry. There are a number of points about evolutionism which, even if you don't want to believe right away in one or the other view, make you stop and question and think a little more about the evidence for and against. It is the same with radiometric dating systems and the evolutionary uniformitarian interpretation of geological strata. There is an excellent book by a professor of geology, Henry Morris, called The Genesis Flood, which tries to interpret the strata, the Ice Age, etc., in terms of the flood of Noah. He presents his evidence and is very scientifically put together. You can read it and agree or disagree, but it's presented on a scientific level. The Institute puts out a monthly newsletter called Acts and Facts, which describes what they're doing, and in every issue they have a little filler which deals with some aspect of evolution or creation. They have been having a great number of debates during the last 5 years at universities, which have been very well attended. Sometimes thousands of students come. The creation scientists are very well prepared. They have read all the latest literature, while the evolutionist scientists often are so confident that they don't particularly keep up with the latest events. Therefore, in the last issue of the magazine Science, which is very evolutionist, one article says that it has become so bad now, the evolutionist scientists are so ill-prepared and are teaching their students so poorly that all you have to do is have a creationist scientist with 3 or 4 facts from the last 5 years, and he will spin circles around the evolutionists. So the evolutionists have been waking up and saying that they have been neglecting their duty to raise up their offspring in the right spirit. They are trying to educate them better now to get back to the original principles of evolution. 7. Various evolutionary ideas. Father Seraphim, there is so much interpretation involved in evolutionary theory that if you ask evolutionists to explain how evolution occurs, they cannot agree on an answer. They used to say it happens by natural selection coupled with mutation, small changes which, after a certain number of generations, finally result in a new kind of creature. But it so happens that mutations are so universally harmful that you can't explain any kind of upward progress by mutations. Right now, there's a big debate going on over whether to throw out Darwinian gradualism altogether and have some other theory. The latest idea they have gone back to, an idea devised 40 years ago, is called the hopeful monster theory. The prominent geneticist Richard Goldsmith of the University of California at Berkeley came up with this idea because he saw that the accumulation of natural selection and mutation could not produce complex structures. Footnote: this theory was rejected by Darwinists when Goldsmith first propounded it in 1940, but it was rehabilitated in 1980 by evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard in his popular article Return of the Hopeful Monster. End of footnote. You cannot explain, for example, the eye by a series of gradual changes because either you have an eye or you don't have an eye. The organism that suddenly gets a retina or some other part of an eye will have no use for it. It has to mate with a creature with the same characteristic, and then that characteristic must be preserved until it develops into a higher form and finally the whole eye develops. This simply can't happen. It doesn't make any sense. You have to have the eye all of a sudden come into existence. Footnote: in his book The Blind Watchmaker, 1985, neo-Darwinian apologist Richard Dawkins has tried to explain the evolution of an eye. Dawkins' arguments have been refuted on the evidence of biochemistry by Michael B. in his seminal book Darwin's Black Box. As Philip E. Johnson comments, to move from Dawkins to B is like moving from the children's library to the laboratory. From Johnson's books, Objection Sustained, page 54, end of footnote. Therefore, Goldsmith proposed that evolution occurs in jumps, large-scale mutations resulting in a hopeful monster that is able to survive and reproduce. Goldsmith invoked this theory to explain the origin of birds. A bird wing is a tremendous thing. If a reptile simply has a bone sticking out of its back, it is not very well adapted to survive. It must have two whole wings which work, and there must be a female and a male with the same wings in order to reproduce them. Therefore, the hopeful monster idea proposed that a reptile laid an egg and out hatched a bird. People now are seriously returning to this idea and trying to find a balance between it and Darwinism because they realize that small changes cannot produce these tremendously complex structures. Footnote: another reason why Stephen Jay Gould, a paleontologist, wanted to rehabilitate the hopeful monster theory was to account for the lack of intermediary species in the fossil record. Gould's revision of Goldsmith's theory, called punctuated equilibrium, is currently being debated by evolutionists. End of footnote. These ideas are for scientists to discuss, but it's interesting for us to be aware of what they are discussing. 8. The limits of biological change. Father Seraphim. Whatever species is still around today comes down in an unbroken link from the same kind of creature in the past. There are many species that are no longer around, but until they became extinct, they were the same kind of thing that they were from the beginning. You can see great numbers of changes within each kind of creature. For example, the dachshund and the German shepherd all come from the same kind, but they're all dogs, and they can mate and reproduce. So too with the races of men. Although they look quite different, they are all of the same kind. Those who call themselves creationists do not say that there are no changes. There are lots of changes in nature, but they are all within certain limits. That's what the whole debate over evolution and creation is all about. Whether the limits are strictly defined according to kinds, which might not be quite the same as species, or whether everything comes from an original globe of organic matter which developed into all the different kinds of things. Everything we know now about the genetic code seems to be against the latter idea. An organism cannot evolve into something that is not in agreement with its genetic code. Much of the debate between evolutionists now centers on how this could be possible. We have not found out how. 9. Human evolution. Student. What do you think of the fossil men that have been discovered? Father Seraphim. Many theories have been coming out in recent years. The Likis in Africa have been making all kinds of discoveries each year. Of course, each person who is making discoveries wants his man to be the ancestor of all mankind. So he wants to overthrow all the previous ideas, come up with a new one, and claim he has found the missing link. So we always take with a grain of salt what these people say. In 1959, Louis and Mary Leakey discovered the skull of an extinct ape, Australopithecus, southern ape, which was generally supposed to be the ape ancestor of all the fossil men, of Homo erectus, etc. 5 years later, they announced that they found human fossils in the same bed as those of the Australopithecus. Footnote: the status of Australopithecus as an extinct ape was established as early as 1954 by the comparative anatomy research of zoologist Solly Zuckerman. The fact that true humans lived as contemporaries with the Australopithecians indicates that the latter had nothing to do with human origins. Following Louis and Mary Leakey's discovery, their son Richard Leakey also found Australopithecus and Homo erectus fossils in the same stratum. End of footnote. Since stone tools were found there also, they named their new find Homo habilis, or handyman. Footnote: since 1964, writes Richard Milton, Homo habilis has been reevaluated, and it has been suggested that one of the hand bones is a piece of vertebra, that 2 more bones could have belonged to a tree-dwelling monkey, and that 6 others came from some unspecified non-hominid. But whatever the merits of the original description, the fact remains that handyman is human, not a missing link. Homo habilis is calculated to have had a small brain, perhaps only half the size of the average modern humans. But as Dr. A. J. White has pointed out, the habilians were also small in stature, so their brains were not small in relation to their body size, rather like modern pygmies. Indeed, one of the ironic aspects of the discovery of Homo habilis is that while Darwinists concentrate their attention on interpreting finger bones and vertebrae at Olduvai Gorge, where the Homo habilis fossils were found, attempting to establish the creature's credentials as a missing link, they appear to have overlooked the fact that only a few hundred miles to the west, in the forests of Zaire, are the Buti people, who are on average only 4 feet 6 inches tall, and who in stature, brain capacity, and even way of life are comparable to Homo habilis. Yet the Buti are modern men in every sense of the word, except that they do not watch television documentaries nor receive grants from science funding bodies. From the book Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, pages 206-207. End of footnote. This threw the whole scenario of human evolution back, because an evolutionary ancestor cannot be in the same bed as its descendant. Homo erectus was also thrown out of the line and placed after Homo habilis, and humans using stone tools are now said to have lived 2 million years ago. Of course, these are all guesses. There are so many holes and difficulties in the various theories, and there is so much that each evolutionist tries to push through his or her own claims. There are even outright hoaxes. When I studied zoology in college in the 1950s, one of the proofs of the evolution of man was the Piltdown man. From the 1890s onwards, there had been a concerted search to find the missing link, which was expected to be half ape and half man. So in 1911, a very clever man in England named Charles Dawson took a human skull, combined it with the jawbone of an ape, and filled down the ape teeth. A year later, Teilhard de Chardin discovered the missing canine tooth. With its very primitive jaw and very advanced skull, this piled-down man was taken to be an evolutionary ancestor of man. Some scientists did question it and had big discussions, but the vast majority accepted it. More than 500 doctoral dissertations were written on piled-down men. Finally, in the 1950s, some scientists tested it by means of the carbon-14 method of dating, which gives fairly accurate results back to 2,000–3,000 years. They found that one part was more ancient, one part was more modern, and so it was obviously two different creatures. Therefore, the whole thing was discredited. Student: what about the skulls they have found of Neanderthal man? Father Seraphim: the Neanderthal man is now accepted as Homo sapiens, same species as man, different variety, no more different from man than Englishmen are different from the Chinese. Footnote: in the late 1980s, some evolutionists suggested that Neanderthal man once again be given his earlier designation, Homo neanderthalensis. However, even they admitted that Neanderthals were contemporary with modern humans and could have interbred with them. End of footnote. Actually, the fossil men are very few in number. Footnote: Richard Leakey has quoted fellow paleontologist David Pilbeam as saying, "If you brought in a smart scientist from another discipline and showed him the meager evidence we've got, he'd surely say, 'Forget it, there isn't enough to go on.' Neither David nor others involved in the search for mankind can take this advice, of course, but we remain fully aware of the dangers of drawing conclusions from evidence that is so incomplete." From Richard E. Leakey's book, The Making of Mankind, 1981. End of footnote. And of course, everything is based on your interpretation. Is it an ape or a man? It is not particularly simple to find something in between both of them. In any fossil that you see, either of primitive man or advanced apes, it does not say, "I am the ancestor of people today." So you cannot tell whether it is an ancestor, a cousin, or not related at all. It's your interpretation. So far, there is actually no persuasive ancient man that really looks as though it is halfway between man and ape. There are different kinds of fossil man, some primitive, some with large skulls, some with small skulls, but they are no more different from each other than are the different men who live today. So the burden of proof in this, I think, is still upon those who want to prove that one comes from the other. Of course, this whole question of whether one comes from the other raises a whole lot of questions in the text of Genesis, about the genealogies, for example. If man is millions of years old, you have to make some big epicycles to account for the genealogies of the patriarchs. In fact, some say that patriarchs aren't really people. They're really just names for vast ages. 10. The limits of scientific inquiry. Student: I am not surprised when you say that ideas of human evolution are changing, as they find more things contributing to the theory of evolution. Ultimately, we will see the whole picture of evolution come to light. Father Seraphim: well, it all depends on your presuppositions, because often those presuppositions are very strong. Student: what I'm saying is that generally what happens in science is that they are going along and they have a theory, and then they find that their suppositions are incorrect, as you said, and then they have to change their theory, and there is a step, an improvement in knowledge, in science. Father Seraphim: yes, and there are certain weak points in the theory of evolution itself as it is put forth now. Of course, we have to understand there are different meanings for that word. the evolution of a particular variety of finch or something, that's not what we are talking about. That's simply a change within a single nature. But evolution as a theory about the origin of the world, that's beyond the realm of science. That's speculation about the beginnings, just like the ancient Greek speculations about whether the world was infinite or always existed, etc. In order to accept the evolutionary theory of origins as it is usually presented now, one has to accept that the 6 days of creation are not a supernatural act, that is, an act that is different in kind from what is happening now. According to the interpretation of the Church, it is very distinct. There were 6 days of creation in which God made the whole world, and He is not doing that anymore. Therefore, you cannot deduce what they were like. Maybe you can deduce back almost to that point, but you can't deduce what the actual beginning was. So I think in that respect, scientists should be much less dogmatic in looking at and discussing the very beginning. The text of Genesis is quite clear that these 6 acts were quite outside of our sphere of knowledge today. We can't know about them at all, except as God Himself has chosen to reveal them. That is why I would say that scientists are off if they try to deduce the beginning from what is happening now. You can take the idea of uniformitarianism, that is, that everything has happened at the same rate as it is happening now, up to a certain point, a few thousand years perhaps. Before that, it is very dubious that everything has been happening at the same rate. 11. The Biblical Chronology. Student, do we know exactly how old the earth is from the Biblical chronologies? Father Seraphim, there actually are questions about this. The Greek Septuagint text and the Hebrew Masoretic text of Genesis are different. According to the Septuagint, the world is about 7,500 years old. According to the Hebrew text, it's about 6,000 years old. It's an obvious discrepancy. How do we solve problems like that? The fathers admit that there can be a little mistake that is handed down. There are simply miscopyings and so forth. In fact, Blessed Augustine has a whole chapter on this question in the book The City of God. Perhaps some scribes added or subtracted 100 years here and there when they were copying the text. The fathers admit that in the scripture there can be small errors. There's no particular patristic teaching that we have to define the world as being exactly 7,490 years old. It could be a little more or a little less. It's not an important question. But whether Adam lived either 7 or 8,000 years ago, or whether he lived millions of years ago, that is an important question. That is a big subject that affects the whole text of Genesis. We have to understand who Adam was, whether he was a person or not, and so forth. If he lived millions of years ago, there are a whole lot of questions that you have to ask about how tradition has interpreted mankind since that time. 12. The pre-existence of souls, reincarnation and evolution. Student, why did Origen believe that the soul came from the spiritual realm down into the body? Father Seraphim, he was under the influence of philosophies which said that matter is evil. People look around and see that sins come because of the flesh, and therefore the idea was developed, especially among the Manichaeans and similar teachers, that matter itself is evil, and that the soul is a noble thing which is imprisoned in matter. From this they developed the idea that the soul has for eons past been in some other realm. Student, why were souls brought down into matter if matter is evil? Father Seraphim, According to Origen, it was because they sinned in that other realm. This represents a dualistic view of the universe. There is one good aspect, the soul, and one evil aspect, matter, the body. The Christian view, on the other hand, sees the soul and the body together, with the knowledge that the body will actually be transformed. In fact, we will see in our study of Genesis that the body in the beginning was different from the way it was after the fall. Student: was there any influence of Eastern ideas on Origen? Father Seraphim: undoubtedly. People came from India to Alexandria, where Origen lived, and they taught there. One of Origen's teachers was from India. Student: the idea of the pre-existence of souls is similar to what Hinduism teaches on the transmigration of souls or reincarnation. Father Seraphim: right. Student: and how is that related to evolution? Father Seraphim: the idea behind the cosmogony of evolution is that everything comes from a single filament. In the beginning there was one blob, and from that comes all living things, animals, insects, plants, etc. Of course, there are immense difficulties in that theory, because you have to show how within that original blob the genetic code and the means of translating it appeared simultaneously. Then you have to show how the information was added to produce the genetic code for man and all the different creatures. This has never been done. The idea of reincarnation is similar in that, according to the ancient Buddhist, Hindu, Greek, and Roman understanding, it involved transmigration into different creatures, beasts, insects, and even plants. In modern times, people have changed that idea. They assume that in their previous lives they were human beings, because they don't like the idea of having been a monkey or a tree or something. People like to think that they were Napoleon or Julius Caesar, but they don't like to think that they were an oak beam in Rome someplace. They are flattering themselves. In general, we can say that this idea that everything is one, like one chain of light which can be divided into different kinds of beings, is not accepted at all by the Holy Fathers. They say that in the beginning all the different kinds of creatures were present, and that from them the seed produces the same kinds of creatures until the end of time.